Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, a senior director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Rear Admiral, thank you so much for joining me.
And thank you for having me today.
I want to talk about something today that has been making headlines both at home and abroad, and that is Greenland. When President Trump was describing his foreign policy after U.S. forces captured Venezuela's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro, he said that we've superseded the Monroe Doctrine and now it's the Don Roe Doctrine. And he said that with this new strategy, quote, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. And since then, he has repeatedly voiced his desire for the United States to acquire Greenland, claiming that the United States needs this for national security. To start off the conversation, what do you make of his continued push to acquire Greenland?
Well, I'd break this up into two things. One is Greenland important to our national security? And two, is the United States owning the sovereignty of Greenland important, a necessary requirement for that? And the answer to the first one is yes. Greenland's important. Greenland's important as a early warning line for our missile defense, pre-Golden Dome, but also as part of Golden Dome. It's certainly a good position to have a long-range search and detection radar operating from. Recognizing that a lot of Golden Dome goes into space, there's still some what's called underlayer required. So it has a missile defense purpose. It's also part of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, where we operate anti-submarine warfare planes from bases in order, in the UK and Iceland personally, but sometimes in Greenland to detect and track Russian submarines. So it does have national security value. But the truth is that since 1951, we've had complete access to Greenland. We signed an agreement. We've had upwards of 19 bases or posts, as well as about 70 facilities, which are small little areas with like communication towers or something, over the years. We've withdrawn that significantly down to one major post, a Space Force base there. But the truth is that the Danish and the Greenlanders have always given us all the access we wanted. And this is despite the fact that we did, in the 1960s, accidentally drop 4 nuclear weapons on Greenland, one of which we never recovered. So I would just say, and basically the punishment was a couple weeks of no flying, and then we're back at it with B-52. So I'll just say gently, the Greenlanders and the Danish have always given us the military posture and access we need. So Greenland's important. The U.S. owning Greenland, not so important.
To that point, then, if they've given us everything we need, and now President Trump is saying essentially and repeatedly today on the global stage, anything less of the United States owning Greenland is unacceptable. I mean, why are we at this point right now?
I think this is a personal issue for President Trump, which is unusual in national security politics. Generally, the president is advocating, from a national security or national perspective. I think this means a lot to him. The way the president negotiates is like a New York real estate mogul, right? Which is always trying to grab leverage. And so this is unusual in foreign policy circles. He's in a real estate deal, you can grab leverage, yell and scream at each other, and then 2 months later be doing the same thing again, or be partnering together 2 months later. In foreign policy, you usually don't treat someone the way the president's been treating the Danish and the Europeans writ large, and then expect 2 months later that, hey, let's work together now on this other issue with China or something else. So that's a little unfortunate. So I would say this is very personality driven. It's unnecessary. It's harming U.S. national security interests long term to take this aggressive an approach. And as I said, Greenland important to national security. U.S. ownership of Greenland not so important to national security.
It does seem, based on what we're seeing at Davos, to be ostracizing some of our allies abroad. Some have said, like the European Commission president, that the United States is still a friend, still an ally. Some have said the United States right now isn't behaving like an ally. And during a marathon press briefing to mark his 1-year anniversary back in office, President Trump was asked, how far are you willing to go to acquire Greenland? He said, you'll find out. But on the stage at Davos today, he struck a different tone. He said the United States won't use military force to acquire Greenland. What do you make of his type of negotiating tactics here? If he's not using military force, what would negotiations look like? Because officials from both Denmark and Greenland met with members of the Trump administration last week, and they said that there are still fundamental disagreements over Greenland.
Well, I was glad he said in Davos that he wouldn't use military force. That would be just massively inappropriate and be a very challenging issue for active duty, senior leaders, to plan or execute a military operation against a treaty ally as ratified by the Senate. I mean, this would get very complicated very fast. So I'm glad he did that. It showed some maturity. In general, however, this whole issue has not shown maturity. And, this is really, the president has treated the Danish in particular, the Europeans in general, with a lot of disdain. The president may not know it, but a lot of us who fought in our wars in the 2010s and early 2020s know that the Danish fought alongside us in Iraq and Afghanistan. They lost personnel at a rate higher per capita than the United States, and they never flinched from a really dangerous, tough assignment, which some European nations did. So he's picked the absolute wrong target here. This is a country that cares about America, that's committed to our national security interests, that has followed our lead in challenging overseas assignments. And to treat him like this is inappropriate, is irresponsible, and will have long-term deleterious effects on U.S. national security, not because Denmark's important, but because all of Europe's important.
On stage, people did breathe a sigh of relief. He even joked, said something to the effect of, I think that's going to be the big headline, that I'm not going to use military force to acquire Greenland. But then he did deliver this message to NATO allies, quote, "We want a piece of ice for world protection and they won't give it. We've never asked for anything else." And then he went on to say this. So they have a choice. You can say yes and we will be very appreciative, or you can say no and we will remember. When you're saying to someone in a negotiation you have a choice, I mean, I don't think there's another way to describe that other than an ultimatum. Do you read this as a threat? What do you think of that statement?
I read the last 3 weeks as an extended threat discussion by the president. And I'm glad he removed the specific instance of using military power or a military force to take Greenland as part of that threat. But this whole discussion has been an extended threat against Denmark, Greenland, and all of Europe. So, yes, it is a threat. It is an inappropriate way to negotiate with an ally, a treaty ally. And the president says things like, "You've never done anything for me." I just listed many things the Danish have done for us, not least of which fight alongside us in Iraq and Afghanistan, sacrifice their troops, their blood, on behalf of our national security interests. So the president mischaracterizes Denmark, mischaracterizes Europe in general, and does us all a disservice with this discussion.
I know earlier in the conversation you said that this could have some real long-term impacts when it comes to our relationships with our allies, as well as some poor impacts when it comes to national security. What exactly do those look like?
Well, look, we're a less trustworthy ally. I mean, why would you cooperate with Donald Trump in the future, or the United States in the future, if there's a potential that we just turn on you like we've turned on Denmark? That'd be one. Number two, some European countries, particularly France, are exploiting this to say we can't rely on the United States for weaponry, and trying to talk other European countries out of buying American defense industrial base equipment and instead buying European, particularly French. That will cost us jobs in America. Not the president's goal, I think, anytime, but particularly in a midterm election year. And third, it characterizes the United States as an opportunistic power, that doesn't have values or interests, that doesn't use a values-based assessment of what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, but only governs by U.S. self-interest. That is not how we've historically portrayed ourselves. It's not how almost anybody in the military thinks about themselves and their role in the United States military. And it's certainly not how our previous presidents, including President Trump in Trump 45, have operated.
European leaders have backed Denmark and Greenland here. Greenland. The prime minister there said that one thing must be clear to everyone. Greenland does not want to be owned by the United States. Greenland does not want to be governed by the United States. Greenland does not want to be part of the United States. I mean, that's pretty blunt. President Trump is blowing right past that, saying we still want to negotiate, we will negotiate, still pushing to acquire Greenland. I'm curious, if I'm China right now, if I'm Russia, how am I viewing this, and what exactly do you think this means for both Taiwan as well as Ukraine?
So, I mean, both China and Russia must appreciate the theatrics that are playing out. And when your allies are weaker together, you're in a stronger. When your adversaries are weaker together as allies, then you're in a stronger position. In other words, if the U.S.-European transatlantic alliance weakens, Russia's in a stronger position. If the U.S.-European transatlantic alliance weakens, China is in a stronger position. This has to worry Ukraine because, one of the things the president can do is stop providing weapons for sale to Ukraine, or stop providing intelligence support to Europe and Ukraine about Russian movements. These would severely hamper Ukrainian defensive operations over the winter and next spring and summer when the Russians attack again. From Taiwan's point of view, the Taiwan doesn't rely heavily on Europe as a security partner or security support, but there is an expectation that Europe would work closely with the United States in providing economic pressure on China should it do something inappropriate towards Taiwan. And even that opportunity, that likelihood is decreasing as President Trump ostracizes the United States from Europe.
You and I have talked about how unpopular this idea for the United States to acquire Greenland is in Europe. Certainly not popular amongst the people of Greenland, and it doesn't really seem to be popular here at home. Doesn't seem to have too much support, according to some recent polling. A Reuters Ipsos poll found only 17% of Americans support Trump's push for Greenland, and just 4% of Americans think it's a good idea for the U.S. to utilize the military to acquire the territory. Does this lack of domestic support, certainly the lack of international support, do you think that deters President Trump in any way here?
Well, I do think the lack of support for a military operation is probably why he's walked away a little bit from that. 4% is a pretty small number. Don't think I want to hang out with any of those 4%. I would say that probably has tempered him slightly. But I think this is something the president holds true to himself. I mean, this is something he believes. He believed it in Trump 45. He just didn't do much about it. In Trump 47, he's been much more active about doing what he thinks is right. I'm arguing that he's wrong. He doesn't agree with me. He's president. So we're going to have to deal with the stress that this issue is causing for the foreseeable future. But it is not helpful. And the president in the long term will suffer for these actions, and the United States will suffer for these actions. And potentially, as you mentioned, Ukraine, Taiwan, and others will suffer as the transatlantic alliance weakens every time the president speaks.
Trump's push for Greenland continues to be a big headline here at home. It's also one of the main topics of conversation on the global stage. We are certainly seeing that at Davos. So I'm curious, what exactly are you looking out for next, especially since you've been highlighting these long-term impacts we could be seeing because of this push?
Well, we'll have to see how the Europeans respond to this in terms of okay, if you do, we've threatened tariffs, for non-compliance, threatened European countries with tariffs. How they respond, do they respond with tariffs? Do they respond by saying, we're going to ignore your defense industrial base? That hurts. Are they going to flow more troops into Denmark? More troops into Greenland as a demonstration of their support? I think that's less necessary now that the president has taken an idea of a military operation off the table. But in general, I think, we now need to see the European response. The president has, doubled and tripled down his argument over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Now it's time for the Europeans to respond.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for here. And as we continue to keep our eye on all the talk about Greenland, I hope you can come back on and join me and break it down. Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you so much for the time. You're welcome back anytime.
Well, thank you for having me. And certainly Greenland was not on my bingo card for things to talk about in 2026. And I hope we only have to talk about it 1 or 2 more times.